talking about here on my channel right now. It's all about Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively's.
In the ever-shifting labyrinth of Hollywood scandals, courtroom whispers, and orchestrated media spectacles, there are stories that rise above mere gossip and turn into cultural flashpoints. Stories that not only expose the private maneuverings of celebrities, but also unveil the powerful machinery of narrative manipulation that operates behind the shimmering curtain of fame. And few stories embody that reality more clearly than the current entanglement swirling around Taylor Swift, Blake Lively, and Justin Baldoni, a story that at first seemed like little more than an entertaining celebrity blind item, but has rapidly grown into a full-blown exposé of how gossip blogs, local media outlets, fan-driven speculation, and Hollywood PR machines collide, contradict, and reinforce each other, creating an atmosphere in which perception becomes more consequential than fact, reputation more fragile than truth, and where personal alliances can determine the outcome of public judgment more effectively than any courtroom ruling. So to trace this unfolding drama, we must go back to the curious reporting discrepancies that triggered it all, when a series of headlines emerged suggesting that Justin Baldoni, the actor and director frequently associated with glossy romance roles, but more recently thrust into the unforgiving glare of scandal, had somehow shielded Blake Lively from serving obligations tied to Taylor Swift. Headlines that seemed outrageous enough to capture mass attention, but confusing enough to sow doubt. And this was no coincidence, for within hours competing outlets began pushing alternate versions of the same story, with tabloids claiming one thing, local journalists countering with another, and anonymous insiders whispering yet another contradiction.
For within hours competing outlets began pushing alternate versions of the same story, with tabloids claiming one thing, local journalists countering with another, and anonymous insiders whispering yet another contradictory tale, leaving fans, critics, and cultural commentators scrambling to parse the chaos. And in that maelstrom one consistent name kept appearing: Blake Lively, once the embodiment of Hollywood glamour, now increasingly painted by her detractors as a manipulator skilled at hiding behind others, letting colleagues, friends, or even partners take the fall while she maintained her carefully curated image of effortless perfection. And so when Baldoni was portrayed as the man refusing to serve Taylor Swift while Blake hid behind him, the narrative was already primed for public consumption. An image that fused shock value with plausibility, because Blake has long been dogged by accusations, whispered in corners of Hollywood, of using her charm to deflect accountability, and Taylor Swift, meanwhile, has built her empire on controlling her own narrative, reclaiming victimhood and turning betrayal into art, which made her the perfect fall in this story. The archetypal heroine confronting a pair of Hollywood insiders who appeared determined to stonewall her. Yet to understand why this particular rumor caught fire, one must examine the way media ecosystems feed on confusion, for gossip blogs thrive on being first, local news outlets thrive on being correct, and PR teams thrive on muddying the water so thoroughly that truth becomes irrelevant. All of which played out in real time as stories of Baldoni's refusal to serve Swift collided with reports that nothing of the sort had happened, that papers had been filed elsewhere, that obligations had been met, and that the real story was not Baldoni's defiance but rather the deliberate leaking of selective details designed to make it look that way.
So what looks like a petty quarrel is in fact a carefully choreographed drama in which careers, contracts, and millions of dollars are at stake, for if Blake's name is tarnished, her endorsements and roles falter. If Baldoni is seen as unreliable, his directing projects may stall. And if Taylor is framed as a perpetual victim, her cultural power paradoxically grows stronger, fueling her artistry and reinforcing her branding as the ultimate survivor of betrayal, heartbreak, and manipulation. And so the stakes are not merely personal but systemic, because Hollywood has always thrived on narratives that pit women against women, allies against friends, and public image against private reality. And in this case the press has found a perfect storm. For consider the blind items that began to circulate in the wake of the confusion. Those cryptic whispers in gossip columns suggesting that a late-night attempt at damage control had gone disastrously wrong. That an actor, implied to be Baldoni, believed himself clever enough to outmaneuver not only the media, but also the opposing legal team, and that his arrogance had backfired, exposing the very manipulation he had hoped to conceal. And while blind items are never definitive proof, They thrive precisely because they confirm the suspicions fans already want to believe, and when juxtaposed with Taylor Swift's reputation for vigilance, her habit of planting Easter eggs and subtle digs into her work, the narrative suddenly became irresistible. Blake Lively hiding, Justin Baldoni shielding, Taylor Swift fighting back, and the press racing to frame the story before anyone could fact-check. Yet behind all of this lies a deeper cultural question, namely why audiences are so hungry to see glamorous figures like Blake and Taylor at odds, why the image of a male intermediary like Baldoni caught between them fuels speculation, and why scandal has become not merely a byproduct of fame but a commodity in itself, because the reality is that scandal sells, it drives clicks, it boosts advertising, it energizes fan bases, and in an industry where attention is currency, creating a scandal, whether based in truth or fabrication, is often more valuable than avoiding one, which is why critics argue that Blake's alleged hiding behind Baldoni was not a misstep but a calculated tactic, one that allowed her to test public reaction without directly exposing herself, to see whether audiences would side with Taylor or be distracted by Baldoni's role as the apparent blocker, and if the latter happened, she could quietly emerge unscathed, leaving Baldoni to bear the brunt of criticism. Yet in doing so she underestimated the ferocity of Swift's fan base, a community that not only dissects every rumor, but also mobilizes en masse to defend their idol, amplifying stories, creating hashtags, and flooding comment sections until narratives tilt decisively in Taylor's favor. And so even as tabloids tried to paint the story as ambiguous, the broader public conversation crystallized around the idea of Taylor once again being wronged, Blake once again being duplicitous, and Baldoni once again being reckless. And this is how media scandals evolve, through the interplay of selective leaks, fan speculation, and corporate spin, each feeding the other until the truth is not only obscured but rendered irrelevant, replaced by a collective perception that feels truer than fact. And in that perception Blake is hiding, Baldoni is refusing, and Taylor is fighting, whether or not the paperwork or courtroom reality supports it. And therein lies the exposé, that what we are witnessing is not a scandal born of fact, but a scandal born of narrative manipulation. A case study in how celebrities weaponize ambiguity, how media platforms monetize confusion, and how audiences willingly collude by preferring the drama of betrayal to the banality of truth. And if there is a lesson here, it is that Hollywood scandals are never accidental, that every leak, every rumor, every blind item serves a function, whether to distract from a larger controversy, to test public opinion, or to reposition a celebrity within the cultural imagination. And in this case the function appears to have been Blake Lively's preservation of image, Justin Baldoni's attempt to shield or stall, and Taylor Swift's inevitable transformation of victimhood into power, a dynamic that will no doubt continue to play out in future headlines, future whispers, and future exposés. Because in Hollywood the truth is never what it seems, it is what we are told to believe. And the real scandal is not whether Baldoni refused to serve Swift, or whether Blake hid behind him, but rather that we believed it mattered at all, that we allowed ourselves to be drawn into the drama, to become complicit in the performance, and in doing so we reaffirmed the very system that manufactures these scandals, ensuring that the cycle will repeat, with new names, new alliances, and new betrayals, again and again, for as long as fame endures. Just with one headline but with a tangled web of speculation, gossip, and manipulation that has defined Hollywood scandals for decades. And in the recent saga that pulled Taylor Swift, Blake Lively, and Justin Baldoni into the same whirlwind of accusations and misreporting, we can see the anatomy of how power, perception, and media collide in ways that blur the line between fact and fabrication, leaving the public to sort through fragments of truth hidden beneath waves of strategic leaks, blind items, subpoenas, and PR spin, because the moment whispers began circulating that Baldoni had allegedly been served with subpoenas on behalf of Swift in a legal context involving Lively, the tabloids pounced, rushing to print salacious stories without the rigor of confirmation. And as always happens in this ecosystem, those headlines spread like wildfire, framing a narrative that, while enticing, was not grounded in reality, since later clarifications showed Baldoni had not in fact been served. Yet the correction came far too late to prevent reputational fallout and confusion. And this misreporting, some say deliberately amplified by Lively's camp, was not merely a mistake, but an example of how carefully orchestrated narratives can be planted to distract, confuse, and protect the true power players in Hollywood's shadow games. Because if we step back, we see a pattern where celebrities under scrutiny, like Lively in her ongoing tensions with legal critics and public image crises, often benefit when someone else becomes the headline, even if only temporarily. And Baldoni, whose own career is marked by earnest attempts at building a reputation as a thoughtful filmmaker and actor, found himself unfairly branded in association with subpoenas, a legal term that in the court of public opinion often carries the stigma of guilt, secrecy, or being implicated in matters the audience cannot fully understand. And herein lies the danger of blind items and half-verified gossip, which operate just with one headline but with a tangled web of speculation, gossip, and manipulation that has defined Hollywood scandals for decades. And in the recent saga that pulled Taylor Swift, Blake Lively, and Justin Baldoni into the same whirlwind of accusations and misreporting, we can see the anatomy of how power, perception, and media collide in ways that blur the line between fact and fabrication, leaving the public to sort through fragments of truth hidden beneath waves of strategic leaks, blind items, subpoenas, and PR spin. Because the moment whispers began circulating that Baldoni had allegedly been served with subpoenas on behalf of Swift in a legal context involving Lively, the tabloids pounced, rushing to print salacious stories without the rigor of confirmation. And as always happens in this ecosystem, those headlines spread like wildfire, framing a narrative that, while enticing, was not grounded in reality, since later clarifications showed Baldoni had not in fact been served. Yet the correction came far too late to prevent reputational fallout and confusion. And this misreporting, some say deliberately amplified by Lively's camp, was not merely a mistake, but an example of how carefully orchestrated narratives can be planted to distract, confuse, and protect the true power players in Hollywood's shadow games. Because if we step back, we see a pattern where celebrities under scrutiny, like Lively in her ongoing tensions with legal critics and public image crises, often benefit when someone else becomes the headline, even if only temporarily. And Baldoni, whose own career is marked by earnest attempts at building a reputation as a thoughtful filmmaker and actor, found himself unfairly branded in association with subpoenas, a legal term that in the court of public opinion often carries the stigma of guilt, secrecy, or being implicated in matters the audience cannot fully understand. And herein lies the danger of blind items and gossip, which operate in the gray zone between fact and fiction, offering just enough plausibility to hook the public, but not enough transparency to withstand serious scrutiny. Yet they thrive because people crave scandal, and the media, especially tabloids, thrive on feeding that craving, knowing that retractions and clarifications never travel as far or as fast as the initial juicy headline, a truth proven once again in this case, because when Baldoni was finally cleared of being served, the narrative had already sunk into the cultural consciousness, leaving him with a residue of suspicion and leaving the real question of why this rumor was so loudly amplified largely unanswered, unless of course one considers the possibility of deliberate misdirection, a possibility that insiders point towards when examining the role of Lively, whose carefully curated image as a charming, stylish actress and mother has in recent years been shadowed by allegations of manipulative PR tactics, quiet rivalries, and behind-the-scenes power struggles with figures like Swift, once her close ally and now increasingly positioned as a competitor in the arenas of cultural influence and narrative control. Because it is no secret that Swift, one of the most powerful artists in the world, operates with her own formidable PR machinery, often described as meticulous, strategic, and relentless. And when her name is dragged into misreporting about subpoenas, it is not simply an accident but part of the larger battlefield of perception where being portrayed as legally entangled or secretly fighting with former friends can chip away at her carefully built empire of relatability, artistry, and empowerment. So the subpoena rumor became not just a hiccup in Baldoni's story, but a weapon in a larger war of image, raising the question of who benefits from such chaos. And time and again, analysts point back to Lively, not necessarily as the originator but as the quiet beneficiary, since any narrative that half-verified position or casts doubt on Baldoni's stability creates breathing room for Lively to redirect scrutiny away from her own controversies. particularly the legal disputes and criticisms about her business dealings and selective friendships. And what makes this scandal particularly revealing is not simply the misreporting itself, but the mechanisms by which it spread, because the media ecosystem that handled this story is not neutral, with tabloids chasing clicks, blogs repackaging half-truths, and local outlets, often more careful, struggling to cut through the noise. A dynamic that exposes the power imbalance where wealthy celebrities can hire legal teams to intimidate small creators or gossip reporters into silence through threats of subpoenas, cease and desists, and lawsuits. And indeed, many small creators who whispered about Lively's behind-the-scenes maneuvers reported a chilling effect after hearing about subpoenas, fearing that speaking too boldly about her could bring them legal trouble, which reveals the darker underbelly of celebrity culture where the appearance of legal action, whether real or rumored, is enough to silence dissent, creating a climate of fear that serves the powerful. And this climate is precisely what blind items exploit. Because blind items thrive in the gaps where truth cannot be openly spoken due to legal intimidation, allowing speculation to flourish without accountability. And while many dismiss blind items as entertainment, in scandals like this they act as shadow evidence, fragments of truth that cannot be said outright but circulate as whispers until they explode into mainstream coverage. As happened here when the vague suggestion that a major actor was ducking subpoenas evolved into specific claims about Baldoni, claims that tabloids eagerly amplified, even as insiders knew the real story was more complicated and more connected to Lively's maneuvers than to Baldoni's conduct. And so we arrive at the crux of the exposé. The scandal is not simply about whether subpoenas were served, but about how narratives are manipulated, how power protects itself, and how the public becomes a pawn in battles between celebrities, their PR teams, and the media, because Swift's history with stalkers and legal disputes is well documented, and using her name in this subpoena rumor added a layer of plausibility that made it irresistible to the press. Yet the true effect was to create noise, muddy reputations, and obscure the question of who was actually leveraging the legal system to intimidate others, a question that points squarely at Lively, whose reputation for quiet ruthlessness has grown among insiders even as her public persona remains glossy. And when we analyze the timing of the subpoena rumor, coinciding with mounting scrutiny on Lively's own legal entanglements, the pattern suggests a classic PR strategy: distract, deflect, and redirect, a strategy made all the more effective by the willingness of tabloids to privilege speed over accuracy, because in the economy of scandal, being first matters more than being right, and the damage is done long before the truth catches up, leaving figures like Baldoni with lingering reputational wounds, and leaving the public more confused than informed, which in turn serves those who thrive in confusion, since in confusion the powerful can operate unchecked, manipulating narratives to their advantage. And so the scandal becomes not just a story about subpoenas but a cautionary tale about the machinery of Hollywood, the vulnerability of even respected actors like Baldoni, the precariousness of cultural icons like Swift when targeted by legal rumor, and the dangerous effectiveness of figures like Lively who, whether or not they directly orchestrated this specific rumor, embody the archetype of the celebrity who weaponizes perception, law, and media to maintain control. And in the end what remains is the lesson that scandals are rarely about what they see on the surface, that behind every blind item and misreported headline is a network of agendas, rivalries, and manipulations, and that until the public learns to read these stories not as isolated gossip, but as pieces of a larger puzzle of power, we will remain susceptible to being misled, entertained by distraction while the truth hides in plain sight, serving those who understand that in Hollywood, control over narrative is control over survival, reputation, and ultimately legacy. Subscribe my channel Coravanta for more updates daily. We says to sorry because we did not upload yesterday. Thanks or watching. Subscribe my channel. Thanks. Subscribe my channel Coravanta for more updates daily. We says to sorry because we did not upload yesterday. Thanks or watching. Subscribe my channel. Thanks.